The Baltimore Ravens have had a busy few days of coaching news and coaching decisions, and that did not change on Wednesday. We talk about the latest and so much more coming up next on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens. We are your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, and I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here today, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day and your first listen of the day. Free and available on all podcasting platforms, including in video form on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to the channel, and in audio form where you can follow along and subscribe over there. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by PrizePicks. Download the app and use code LOCKEDONNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Here with me today to break down the latest happenings in the Baltimore Ravens world is from Film Study Ravens. It is Ken McKusick. And Ken, really appreciate you taking the time talking some Ravens football. Again, wish we were talking leading up to the Super Bowl, but the Ravens can't get the job done in Buffalo. How are your overall feelings on the team right now, considering how disappointing the end of the year was?
Going to be another offseason of transition. That was true last year. Great teams don't really fear change. They embrace it and they find ways to improve from it. This team will have, almost as many free agents going. But if you look back at the list of free agents the Ravens lost last year, they didn't miss too many of them. Kevin Zeitler. After that, I don't think they missed Patrick Queen, Geno Stone, Ronald Darby, a whole bunch of other players Devin Duvernay, who were pretty good players for them. They managed to get by without them.
And at least in terms of quality free agents at the time, all those big names, it's not that big of a list for Baltimore this season. Obviously, you're going to have to make decisions on guys like Ronnie Stanley, Patrick McCary, Brandon Stevens, and some we'll get into throughout this show. But it's interesting because it feels like a year where the Ravens can actually build upon a lot of what they built up this season instead of having to lose all these guys and then try to replace this guy and then go and replace that guy. I think that's another interesting dynamic. And it's even on the coaching staff, which we'll get to. It's not like they're losing Mike McDonald, Denard Wilson, Anthony Weaver, etc. There's been some shakeups for sure, but it's not those like high profile names.
Yeah, I mean, I am a little concerned about the depth of youth on the coaching staff in general, that they haven't really set themselves up well for succession planning. I think that ought to be a big part of this offseason. Pagano does not really exactly fit that in terms of the acquisition of him, but hopefully they'll have others where they pick up some younger guys in some junior roles that they'll work up naturally through the system.
Yeah, Pagano will be a big talking point here today, and it kind of goes hand in hand with what we're going to talk about right now, and that is the fact that the Ravens did make another coaching change. The Ravens and Chris Hewitt, their longtime coach, has been with the organization since 2012. They've mutually agreed to part ways, according to Tom Pelissero, and obviously Hewitt came in from Rutgers as their running back and cornerback coach. He was their DB coach until 2019, then picked up the title of pass defense coordinator, got secondary coach and pass game coordinator, and then actually last year became their assistant head coach and continued to kind of climb the ranks. He had DC interviews last season. Jacksonville was one he interviewed for, and he's expected to have interest. But with Pagano coming in, it kind of created this interesting dynamic of where did Hewitt fit into the equation? And now, Ken, we clearly know that there wasn't a fit at all.
I'm all for, by the way, the way the Ravens do it, that they make up whatever title they need to bring in a coach they want. So they can give them whatever title they really want. But when you see somebody as a senior secondary coach, even if you're a secondary coach and assistant head coach, you probably don't like that. And so I could understand how this goes. In the business world, happens all the time. People get hired in over, and it's usually a good signal it's time to move.
Do you feel like this whole situation happened with Pagano and Hewitt because of what we saw in the early part of the season this past year? Was this a long time coming for Hewitt? Because he's a respected coach around the league. Clearly, and we'll get into it, Pagano and Harbaugh have had that relationship and that connection. It kind of came off of a phone call, and it happened that way. Do you feel like this is a move that was necessary, this kind of switch up, or do you think that it was more of opportunity presenting itself, and now here we are?
I don't think it was planned before the 24 season. I think Hewitt was promoted into a very significant role with the departure of Denard Wilson. He's a younger guy as coaches go, and was still a guy who had succession planning aspirations, and obviously had interviews to do so before. I think the Ravens would love to, cultivate a coach like Hewitt and have him go somewhere else. It always adds to the Harbaugh tree. Potentially, in his case, also could give the Ravens comp picks in exchange for the minority hiring thing. So you don't want to lose a guy like that for no good reason. And I think they had a tough year in 2025. It was his first year with the secondary. And I'm not sure where he is in his contract, but that could be what the issue was, that he might have had 1 year left on his contract and the Ravens were not willing to negotiate additional years. And oftentimes that creates a lame duck year where neither party really wants the other one there. And so that's often a mutual part ways. When I hear that in the business world, you look for the memo to say one of two things. The first is leaving the company to pursue other endeavors. That usually means we fired him. Okay. if it means something like he's leaving the company to join, such and such another company, well, then the guy really left for an opportunity of his. In this case, this is I think truly a mutual discussion, very similar to the Wink Martindale move a few years ago.
And it makes sense. And particularly with the quite literally tale of two halves the secondary had over the course of this year, something had to happen there, despite the fact the secondary was able to get it together. And clearly a lot of that blame was placed on Zach Orr early. And then as we kind of saw how the Marcus Williams and Eddie Jackson situations developed, it was clear that, Maybe Zach Orr is just working with a bad hand and figured it out. So it's interesting to see how it all evolved.
Let me go back to this for a second, because I think the thing you're hitting on may be the reason he ended up being let go or hired over, is that early in the season, we don't know who was advocating for the safeties to be left in place for as long as they were, and they were left for 10 weeks. Could be Hewitt was the guy, and he was saying, hey, look, we got to hope these guys turn it around. I don't want you putting the Hamilton on the back end. I don't want you doing this. That'll just degrade us in other ways. And then finally, others had to overrule, whether that was Harbaugh or with influence from Pease, whatever it might have been, to make those changes anyway.
And that's a good point, because clearly there was somebody or multiple people in the organization. It was clear after the first handful of weeks that something probably needed to change. You go until after that second Cincinnati game, and then you finally make that move. Mm-hmm. I'm sure someone just said enough is enough. We're doing what we need to do, because it was almost like probably an overrule situation, whether that was Zach or John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta, Steve Bisciotti. It just wasn't working, and they made that change, and it worked for the better. But with Chris Hewitt versus Chuck Pagano, I know we talked about this a bit on your show, Ken, in terms of what the expectation should be with the secondary moving forward. It's going to have a lot to do with the personnel they bring in. There are a couple free agents that we're going to get into in terms of what they could do with those players. Schematically, do you expect a lot of change? Because the Ravens like to keep their general philosophy, and coaches that come in usually add a wrinkle or two of their own, but it doesn't shift completely away from what we're used to here.
Yeah. I agree. I think this was a move that had to be made, and he may have been the one that was holding it up in terms of the decision to do it. And in terms of what Pagano brings, going forward to the position, I think we'll see a lot of the Ravens DNA be preserved. We talked about this a little bit on my show. Continue with a too high shell is probably something the Ravens will stay with. It's interesting because the last time Pagano was in Baltimore, they really didn't have a too high shell. They played a lot of single high with Ed Reed, and he had that luxury when he was here. But they have become really exclusively that over the last few years, and I think they've been successful at it. So it's like the Ravens run game and a lot of the things they do in terms of running out a shotgun and whatnot, or running out a pistol in 2019. They become part of the Ravens DNA, and they like to hold on to those things.
And I think the big thing with Pagano is a lot of people wanted to see him in Baltimore beyond the year that he had at defensive coordinator. Obviously came in with John Harbaugh in 2008, but only had that one season as the head guy on defense because that defense was so good. I mean, he went to Indianapolis, had a good career over there with the Colts before going to Chicago, was their DC. But some of the philosophies that he brings and some of that defense, I mean, what do you remember about that defense in particular? Not, you talked about the too high stuff there, but more in depth about what that defense and those philosophies could potentially bring to this 2025 unit.
Well, 2011 was a great year for the marriage of pass rush and coverage. And it's always a great year for that marriage, by the way. When it's working, it's great. The 2000 Ravens benefited from the 2006 Ravens, were terrific at it. The 2008 Ravens were terrific at it. And really all of the early Harbaugh years, they had good units were there when they didn't have very significant injury. But 2011 was a good one. Jimmy Smith was there. I believe that was Jimmy Smith's rookie year. I think he was drafted in 2011, yep. and he got hurt on like the first play of the season. He missed a portion of the year, and already even in 2012 he was still coming back. And then all of a sudden he's the MVP of the Super Bowl defensively, not officially, of course, but in terms of the plays he made on to take. He's a receiver that begins with a C, last name for the 49ers, and took his head off. Yeah, Crabtree took his head off a couple of times on that right sideline. But yeah, if Jimmy Smith is kept out of the lineup by the corners that were there, and Lardarius Webb had the greatest season probably ever by a Ravens cornerback in 2011, you have a lot of tools to work with, and they certainly did.
And it's going to remain to be seen how this all plays out. But just initial thoughts, Ken, do you believe that Chris Hewitt for Chuck Pagano will result in a net positive based off of what we've seen from the secondary with Chris Hewitt last year versus what we've known Pagano to be and the potential he has to maybe change some stuff around?
I trust the Ravens to know that it will. I think that whatever reason they're able to diagnose the in-house coaching issues they have. This is a great strength of Harbaugh, is hiring coaches who know what they're doing. I hope that Pagano will look as part of his job to find a couple of guys to mentor who are younger, highly relatable coaches, and that'll turn this into additional value as well, where the Ravens have the next coordinator pipeline guys on their way under Pagano's tutelage.
And I think that with a guy like Zach Orr, I think Dean Pease helped be a stabilizing presence for him last season. And obviously it feels like from John Harbaugh's comments, Pease will be taking a bit of a step back. So bringing in a Pagano to be that sounding board for Zach Orr, I think will be a very positive thing moving forward. And Pagano revealed his reasons for choosing the Ravens, we'll get into in the final part of the show. But coming up, we'll take a bit of a break from the coaching shakeup because Jamal Lewis, legendary Ravens running back, sounded off on the Ravens. He defended Mark Andrews and a lot more. So stay tuned. We got a lot coming up on Locked On Ravens. First, this show was brought to you by TurboTax. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who could do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Back here, Locked On Ravens with Ken McKusick. I am Kevin Ostreicher. And Ken, shifting away a little bit from the coaching conversation. Obviously, the Buffalo game was a pretty big disappointment in terms of a lot of the same things that have happened to the Ravens in the past, whether it be turnovers, big mistakes that cost them these playoff games. They all reared their ugly head again in this one. So before we get into what Jamal Lewis said, what were your overall thoughts on that game? And why do you think it continues to go this way for the Ravens?
Well, it definitely was high leverage plays in a lot of ways. And the Ravens have been on both sides of this in the playoffs. You go back to the 2000 win at Tennessee. That's exactly how they won that game. They won a bunch of high leverage plays in a game where they lost the yardage battle very significantly. You come out of this Buffalo game, and they played better, I thought, in the weather. They outran. They certainly outpassed the Bills in the game. It came down to turnovers and a couple of 2-point conversions that didn't work out. Not an ideal situation, but one where I don't look at this game as the Ravens failed to impose their will on the Bills. They failed on a few plays. It's very different from, say, the loss in 2006 to the Colts, the loss in 2003 at home to the Titans, the loss in 2019, even in a little bit different way. They moved the ball reasonably effectively. They ran a ton of plays in that game. It's just incredibly frustrating to see them lose that way. They even all turnovers that missed 2-point conversions, they still way outplayed the Bills, and they were very close there at the end of the ball game. I think if I was upset about one thing in terms of the game, it was a coaching decision, and not the one Jamal Lewis is going to point out, but the fact that they did not take their time getting down into the end zone at the end of the game. I think coaches, one of the big failings, and if I had a negative hardball point to make, which I'll be doing some shows on this, it's every bit as important to consider what happens after you score and when you score for purposes of winning the game. And by not scoring the last 10 seconds or the last 30 seconds even, they probably reduced their chance to win that game by 60%.
They left a minute 31 on the clock for Josh Allen there. And assuming that they do tie the game, I feel like it was more than enough time for him to go down and make something happen.
And to be clear, that's the only assumption that matters. Because if they didn't tie the game, there's almost no chance that they have an onside kick and recover. And they had one timeout left, so they weren't going to get the ball and force them to punt it back. So the only chance is we score, we tie, we go to overtime, and we win it. That's the only path to victory. Then you have to increase the probability of that path.
Yeah, 100%. And the one that Jamal Lewis had to say, this was an interview with TMZ, on the 2-point conversion, that obviously is a big controversy point. Jamal Lewis saying, honestly, why were we in that position? Why didn't we take the points and kick the field goal earlier? So therefore, it wouldn't have to go for 2-point conversions. First of all, if you did need to go for that, why not hand the ball off to Derrick Henry, a 250-pound running back that you're paying instead of taking the risk of throwing it? So a lot to unpack there with multiple different reasons why Jamal Lewis does not agree. Ken, do you agree with Jamal Lewis and what he had to say?
Yeah, so let's start with was it the right decision to go for 2? And he's talking about on the first touchdown where they need to tie it at 21, I think, right? 21?
Yes.
So completely the right decision to go for it. Any mathematical analysis of this will tell you when you the simplest, 2 simple rules. If you want to ever try to not say something stupid at a cocktail party, or more likely at a bar, about what's the right strategy decision, it's like hitting on 12 versus a dealer 10. It is always the right call, virtually regardless of any game situation, to do it. To do one of 2 things. One is go for it on 4th and 1 from anywhere on the field. And I'm including in your own 11-yard line. Got to be a neutral game script, by the way, for that to be true.
Sure.
And the other is going for 2 when you're down 2. For it not to be the right move, you have to fool yourself on the assumptions going into your model about what the Ravens' chances are. And there's people who say, look, the Ravens made 0 out of 5 2-point conversions. Well, the conclusion you come from that is it's never the right choice to go for a 2-point conversion, including at the end, because there's a 0% chance of making it. You might as well take the 1, take your chance of converting. I mean, garbage in, garbage out. But any reasonable analysis would tell you you're doing a lot more for your victory probability to go for 2 anytime you're down 2, including the first half, but it becomes much more extreme in the second half.
And we saw the Commanders try to do the same thing against the Eagles when they were down. And I know that there's a lot of controversy on it, and it didn't work out the way for the Ravens that they wanted to. And Jamal Lewis even was asked, okay, what about Mark Andrews in this whole situation? And he said the probability of you making that catch on a 2-point conversion is very low, period, because it is a 2-point conversion. I wouldn't even be bothered by it. I'm sure it's going to sting and it hurts right now, but at the same time, it's not his fault because he never should have been in that position, which is interesting. Consider, look, the play was tough. It was a bad drop by Mark. And if the Ravens had made the first 2-point conversion, they're not in that situation. This, that, and the other. If they had kicked the field goal, if they kicked the extra point, it would have just been okay. Extra point ties the game. But in terms of that play, Ken, how'd you kind of see that unfold, and what's your overall thought on it?
No problem with the play call. One reason why that's a particularly good play call for Lamar specifically, you can go back to the beginning of his career where he went, I think, 57, 58 consecutive red zone touchdowns without an interception. Okay. And when he finally did get intercepted, it was in the end zone by Teron Johnson in the playoff game. So it didn't come at an opportune time when the streak finally got broken. But Lamar moving laterally along the line of scrimmage does something specific for that flat route that is really important. It creates space between Lamar and the intended receiver, where if you're Joe Flacco and you're not going to move too much, you're not going to roll too much, you're going to try and throw from the pocket and use the field. Your advantage is you might try and throw a fade route or something. Those are really low percentage throws. This one, it creates a direct line of fire for Jackson to Andrews. They had it. The throw was there. In this case, it was Andrews' fault. Some people said, hey, it could have been higher in his eyes. He'd had a better chance to catch the ball. I don't think you come to any other conclusion than that. I do kind of like the play call. I hate Lamar moving left in that situation. I love Lamar moving right. If Lamar moves left, it better be a misdirection run that he's going on. Lamar moving right and getting that lateral space. It's worked so many times. Why would the Ravens not do it?
Yeah, and I know there have been some arguments about, well, you're losing 50% of the field when you're eliminating that part of it. And I mean, I understand, but the way that the play call worked, I mean, it worked. It's just that the execution was not there, and Mark was the one to drop the football. And the thing about Lamar not placing the throw correctly, I don't really know where else you want it. Like, it was a fine throw, just bad execution. It was tough for Mark. It was a really tough day for Mark in general. And Jamal Lewis talked about those turnovers, saying you can't go into a game like that against an opponent like that in that environment and turn the ball over. Which one of those do you think had the biggest impact of the game in the moment that it happened?
Okay, to address Jamal's comments, for starters, the better the quality of opponent, the more magnified the impact of turnovers are. But I always used to find it funny that there would be announcers who'd come on and tell you this game's going to come down to turnovers. Well, I always said, okay, well, turnovers are usually a function of being behind. So yeah, the team that gets out to a big lead will probably throw some turnovers and the game will be over, and you'll point to the turnover column as if that was it. But it's, again, like teams run because they win. They don't win because they run, kind of thing. And going back to which turnover was most important, I think the Andrews fumble was the big one in the game. I think that was the one where they had a chance to push down and go ahead in the game at that point, right? They were up down 5, I believe, when it was at that point. Would have gone for 2 and had the chance to go up 3 and hold against a field goal.
It was just back-breaking turnover after back-breaking turnover, but it felt like the Mark Andrews one, I agree, Ken, was the big one in my opinion. But we'll get back to Chuck Pagano in the final part of the show, plus dive into the future of this Baltimore Ravens team, because it is a very interesting offseason, the way that it's all setting up for Baltimore. Stay tuned. We got a lot coming your way next on Locked On Ravens. First, the show is brought to you by Gametime. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. One of my favorite memories was attending concerts last year. The energy and excitement were unforgettable. Now, Gametime has made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Gametime Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Recently, I was looking up tickets for the Super Bowl using the Gametime app. With Gametime Picks, I found amazing deals and could even see the view from my seat before buying. The Super Deal is particularly impressive, offering great seats and unbeatable prices. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, spelled LOCKEDON, NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Ken McKusick and Kevin Ostreicher are back here with you on this Thursday edition of the show on Locked On Ravens. And Ken, Chuck Pagano went on the Pat McAfee show because obviously that's where he's been doing his work and doing some other stuff as well. And he talked about his decision to join the Ravens. You and I talked a little earlier in the show just about what the impact will be for Chuck Pagano and the transition away from Chris Hewitt. But something that Chuck Pagano said, which was interesting, was this kind of all came from a text message for another coach. Pagano reached out to Harbaugh and said, hey, I have a coach that is interested. Would you be interested in having him on your defensive staff? And Harbaugh's like, well, let's talk tomorrow, which at that time was Thursday. So let's talk on Friday. They have a conversation. Harbaugh asked him how Pagano's doing, say, hey, you got that itch? Are you ready? Is there an opportunity? And he said it had to be a perfect opportunity for him to go and help John Harbaugh, the organization, the defensive staff. He's very complimentary of what the Ravens have built. He made it clear that he wasn't looking at head coaching opportunities. He doesn't want to have that pressure, even a DC job. I'm not sure many people anticipated Pagano was ready to come out of retirement at any stage here, but the Ravens have had an ability to bring some of these former guys who have been on their staff out because the organization knows their guys. There's familiarity there. And for Pagano, I think it's a role that he can thrive in because there's not all this pressure on him. He can just kind of do his thing and bring in those philosophies.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem to be a good situation for Chuck. A lot of people maybe don't realize his relative age. He's a couple of years older than Harbaugh, so there's not a head coach switch happening here or anything like that. He's not a head coach in waiting here in Baltimore. It's a good opportunity to get a veteran coach back in. They obviously, I think, like we said earlier, they had to be fairly convinced that Hewitt was not going to be a head coaching candidate to make this move. And not only here, but pretty much anywhere, just because there's a lot of additional change left on the table in terms of comp picks. If Hewitt could get a job anywhere, you'd be really excited to have him stay with the Ravens. But obviously they felt like it was not going to happen, or he was not the right guy for the Ravens at the very least.
And the Ravens also, it's not just the Chris Hewitt being out. Also, the inside linebacker coach is no longer with the team. Was inside linebacker a position that you weren't thrilled with this season, or did you see enough?
Definitely not thrilled. Everybody who listens to my show knows how much of a fan I am of the dime defense. So on your high leverage snaps, I want a safety in there anyway. They did have it with Kyle Hamilton, and then they were out of safeties to do that with at the end of the year. They didn't even have another guy. They finally went to Stevens at that position when they played dime. But they had Chris Ford on the field for a lot of snaps, and I thought he was fairly good in terms of meeting his responsibilities. Harrison is very unusual. I mean, I just can't even stress how unusual this is for a guy in the same season, in the same game, and sometimes the same series to play both outside linebacker and inside linebacker. It just does not happen in the NFL because the body types are very different for the two positions. And Harrison is very heavy for a weak side linebacker, and some of that does show up in coverage occasionally. He's a good run defender. He did have some missed tackles this year, but I thought generally speaking, he gave the Ravens something that they needed. I was a little bit surprised by the move off of Trenton Simpson. I didn't think he'd really played poorly enough, but obviously the Ravens know more. There's more from practices. There may be more from Roquan, that Roquan wasn't really happy with the way it was working out. But anyway, the Ravens had their reasons for moving on. Initially, it was just a dime, then to this phony baloney rotation by series that they did for about 2-3 weeks. And then all of a sudden, it's Board and Harrison sharing the duties, and Simpson is in mop-up duty only.
Yeah, a lot more change and moving parts than anticipated. I think a lot of people were very high on Trenton Simpson coming into the season, and it unfortunately just didn't work. And obviously Patrick Queen didn't have a wonderful year in Pittsburgh, but I think that the familiarity that Roquan and PQ had was probably one of the things that was missed the most.
I don't think they missed him at all. I especially at the price. It's $13 million for. I mean, you can't pay that for Patrick Queen. He's a below average linebacker in this league. And did they miss something about him blitzing? Sure. Did they get as good play from the guys they had in there? I think they did. That's the truth of the matter. Patrick Queen missed a ton of tackles, and the guy who made up for it was Deshaun Elliott, who had an unbelievable year. Could easily have been an all-pro safety this year, by the way, and had only 2 missed tackles the whole year, but he essentially was Patrick Queen's missed tackle caddy.
And I agree. I'm not saying that the Ravens missed PQ in terms of like, oh, he was this huge loss in the defense. The struggle reason was because Patrick Queen was not there. But I just think that with the familiarity that he and Roquan had together, it was new for Roquan, and figuring that out. And clearly he was playing next to different guys all the time. So trying to figure that out. But you're exactly right. The Ravens couldn't pay Patrick Queen what the Steelers offered him. And honestly, I don't think they had any interest in paying what the Steelers offered him. So that's what it was.
The Steelers may not have interest in continuing that contract. We'll see if they cut Patrick Queen this offseason, but I think it's a possibility because the contract was written in a very team-friendly way. I don't know if you remember, Patrick Queen on Twitter was talking about north of 4 years, $72 million, what he was expecting to get, and he ends up getting 3 for $40, and also a contract that's written so the Steelers can be out in 1.
So. Yeah, that inside linebacker market was never what people thought it was going to be, and that obviously impacted PQ. And honestly, for those 2 defensive guys who left, it was the big 3 of Madubuike, Queen, and Geno Stone. And it feels like both Queen and Stone could be on different teams next season because Geno had a pretty terrible year himself in Cincinnati. So the Ravens, they're not like missing out by not having Patrick Queen. I just think the replacements that were in place did not have the impact.
How do you feel about the possibility of Stone returning to the Ravens, given their lack of depth at safety?
It could happen. I feel like it's not a terrible idea. It would have to be, I would like to see him more in that third safety role again. Like, I wouldn't want to give him full-time opportunities, but I feel like they are pretty set on Ardarius and Kyle. The thing would be, do they want to move Kyle around again, which I feel like they should want to. I think that's his biggest calling card. So Geno could provide some stability there. And I know, Ken, you are a very big advocate of Kyle Hamilton moving around, and him being placed back there was a necessity at the time, but it clearly limited some of the upside.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So the other part of it too, Ken, Todd Monken gets extended. They're finalizing that extension according to Jeremy Fowler. I know there were some rumblings about him getting head coaching opportunities. He interviewed for a couple of them. He stays in Baltimore. It's a very interesting dynamic with John Harbaugh currently not having an extension. That could change over the course of the next couple of weeks, couple of months, whatever it may be. For Todd Monken, how have you liked his offensive progression over these past 2 seasons? What do you hope to see in year 3?
So first of all, loved it, and I think he's very extension worthy. The Ravens are lucky to get him on an additional deal here. I'm sure it comes with the understanding that if a head coaching opportunity comes up, he can interview for it and leave. But he's a guy who has turned Lamar Jackson into a different quarterback the last 2 years, and specifically in terms of the reliance on the tight ends for a lot of the offense. And it's been a good differentiation because the last 2 years, each of the last 2 years, the Ravens have had over 140 quarterback rating throwing to the tight ends. It's just incredible. Just for a 2-year period for that to occur. So it's not like they can stop the tight ends. It's just doing it on a lot fewer targets right now. So 2022, and some of this is Huntley being in there, they had 195 tight end targets. That dropped to 110 and back up to 138 this year. But they're getting a ton out of that position. And of course, they're getting a lot more out of the receivers. They've gotten much more out of Bateman this year. I think that's terrific. You know, he's gotten a great chest of toys, including Derrick Henry, but he also made something out of that. And he had a little bit of a booby prize in terms of the offensive line he got stuck with. But I think they did the most, he and Warhop, to get what they could out of that group. And I think they did pretty well there. So, yeah, I'm very excited about Monken and what he's brought to the offense.
I think so too. And not only that, but obviously we saw the growth in terms of just general stats of them becoming the best rushing and passing offense in the league. They became an elite red zone offense, an elite third down offense. Their conversion rate skyrocketed. And I think there's a lot of continuity that in today's NFL can be lost, especially with good teams. The Chiefs have had Steve Spagnuolo there forever now, so that's an example of it. And I think a very interesting offseason, considering that the teams are going to have opportunities to improve. So where do you see the biggest needs and positional value that the Ravens could go in, whether it be via free agency, via trade, via draft? And look, these free agent lists for the Ravens, it's not the Patrick Queen, Nnamdi Madubuike, Geno Stone, et cetera, Jadeveon Clowney. Brandon Stevens probably not going to be back. Ronnie Stanley, Patrick McCarry, 2 interesting conversations, but it's not like they have a bunch of high-profile guys that are projected to leave.
Yeah, I mean, Stanley would be a high-profile guy leaving, but they have 4 offensive linemen who could potentially leave, including Cleveland, Jones, McCarry, and Stanley. That would gut their depth on the team. So starting at offensive tackle is again their number 1 need in the draft for the 2nd consecutive year. Whether or not they decide they want to move Rosengarten, I'm doing an offensive tackle review tonight if you want to catch it on filmstudybaltimore.com. But it'll go in depth into why that might or might not be a great move. And I'm not completely sold on it at this point, given the amount of help he's gotten in his first year. It could work out, and they may have to do it, but it'll be a matter of need and not choice, I think, if it happens. That means I think they have to go to the left, to the tackle market again. And ideally, you want a guy who can play left or right. You don't want to just draft a right tackle and hope that your current right tackle can become a left tackle, because that won't necessarily work out. But you want good mirroring ability on that right side or left side, whoever the new guy is going to play. And then you need more depth. I mean, you need more guys who can play on the interior offensive line. Their left guard situation, I would guess that they're probably going to go to Voorhees next year if McCarry is gone. But if they get another draft pick, there may be a competition there, and it may be different from that. Tyler Linderbaum has a very interesting situation. He's up for his 5th year option to be picked up, and I don't think it will be, because they'll have to pay left tackle money to do it, but that'll put the pressure on to re-sign him now prior to year 4 as opposed to prior to year 5. So with Hamilton, they may be able to wait a year, but with Linderbaum, they really can't, based on his position.
It's going to be an intriguing offseason because after this year, you're going to have to make those tough decisions. There are other extensions down the pipeline. And again, money will come off the books. Obviously, Mark Andrews is one of those big names and a few other guys that will have to either figure out what their roles are going to be moving forward. Marlon Humphrey is one of those players. So this is the year where it feels like they can, quote unquote, run it back for the most part, outside of maybe a few guys, and continue to add on to the roster that they already have built up. But Ken, I appreciate you joining me on the show today. Thank you so much. Please tell people where they can find you and what you're working on as the Ravens offseason kicks off.
All right. At Film Study Ravens on Twitter is probably the easiest. And at filmstudybaltimore.com is the website. Working on currently the positional reviews for each group. They're very in-depth. Kevin just came on and did the cornerback review for me. I highly recommend it. I think he's got some great thoughts on it and some good conversation built up there. But there are several out there already on the website. It's available, obviously. It's Film Study. Baltimore Ravens Talk is available on all your podcast platforms.
All the links to Ken's work in the description down below. Be sure to check him out. He knows his stuff. I cannot recommend it enough. So, Ken, again, I appreciate you joining me. And thank you to everybody for listening to Locked On Ravens today, watching Locked On Ravens. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button in video form and follow along and subscribe in audio form for more daily Ravens coverage. And I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.